I'm pretty sure my next guest agrees with me when I say that disability rights are the next great frontier in civil rights. In fact, I'm pretty sure she probably said it long before I ever even thought about it, and that the disability population, like an iceberg, much of it is invisible to the naked eye, but for the people who comprise that population, myself included, it is a subject of enormous importance. It is one that can better our lives, even for those of us who aren't aware it can better our lives. It can still better our lives. It is a topic of utmost importance as we enter full speed into this election year. So I definitely wanted to have her back on to talk about it. So without any further ado, allow me to introduce Rebecca Cokley. She hasn't been on the program for a while. She is, let me get the, you know I like to get the titles right. She is Director of the Disability Justice Initiative at the Center for American Progress. Before that, she was the White House Director of Disability something. And without any further ado, Rebecca, welcome back.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here, RJ.
And what was your title at the White House under Obama?
I was the Director of Priority Placement for Public Engagement for the Office of Presidential Personnel, which basically meant...
Which means, first of all, that I feel much better about not remembering.
It's a ridiculously long title. I was essentially the President's Chief Diversity Officer for political appointments.
So, which is great. And there are a lot of ways we could start, but I want to, in my introduction, I talked about the visibility of disability people. To me, there's a two-dimensional problem, and maybe we can start with one of those dimensions. One is the vast sea of people with disabilities, some of whom don't even know that's what's going on in their lives. That would be me for many years. Others of whom are well aware they have a disability, but don't know that they have rights associated with being disabled. And then there's all of us in the sense that when we become aware of disabled people and how they're treated in the public eye and the public consciousness, we're not aware of the ways in which this diminishes them and all of us. So maybe I want to start with that, okay? Because you recently wrote a piece in Medium that I appreciated a lot about, well, you tell us what it's about. You know the piece I mean.
So there was a young man of Aboriginal descent who also has achondroplasia, which is the most common form of dwarfism. It's what I have. Who his mom posted a video of him on YouTube of his reaction after being subjected to substantial bullying in school. And it's the young man crying, the young man asking for a weapon so he can inflict harm on himself. He's 9 years old. The young man talking about how miserable he was, how he just wanted to die because of how he was treated. And it was a very rough video to watch. We know that students with disabilities, and specifically students with disabilities at the intersection of race and disability, face disproportionately high bullying numbers. As someone who is a little person who grew up in a small, close-knit community with a really big family, I was subjected to some bullying growing up. And I had the benefit of the fact that both my parents were little people, so they directly understood sort of what I was dealing with. This young man has had connections to the dwarfism community in Australia. He has connections to the folks from his First Nations community. But the video just felt really invasive. I mean, we were watching this young man at a moment of such intense pain. And to have that out in the world, once it's out on YouTube, it goes everywhere. And it went viral. And so for me, I found myself, both as a little person and a mom, having a really hard time with the fact that this young man's moment of such vulnerability was now a topic of public conversation and was just out there, and people were making judgments and people were saying things about him and his family. And it was a really hard watch.
Yeah. And so your point in writing about it, I mean, first of all, you were clearly, as you are now, coming from a point of view of compassion towards the child, but not only for the bullying he suffered and the pain that he was in, but for the fact, here's what I took from it, and correct me if you either think I'm wrong or that wasn't what you meant to say, but my takeaway after reading your piece was that a lot of people reached out to help this child with a GoFundMe or Kickstarter or whatever they had, the family had. A lot of people had compassion for him, but that ultimately he was still being treated as almost a totemic figure, as an other, as a symbol. And that I, for example, if I were viewing this as a person who does not share his particular disability, I might contribute $5 or $10, feel good about myself for having watched, feel good and shown compassion without ever thinking about the lifelong implications for that child, or for that matter, for other people with a similar disability, that we're still somehow using them for our own emotional ends. That was my reaction anyway. What do you think of
Definitely.
that?
I think that's definitely legitimate, and where a lot of us were coming from. I think the dwarfism community, separate from the broader disability community, we have such a complicated relationship with media and entertainment. I mean, going all the way back to vaudeville, going back to sideshows, we were bought and sold as property across circuses. We were forcibly bred to create more little people that could be bought and sold across circuses. Moving into the behemoth of The Wizard of Oz, moving forward, things like Game of Thrones and now reality shows. And there's always been this tendency to commodify little people as entertainment. And just this just tremendous amount of voyeurism associated with that. And for me, it was really difficult to watch it just become such this viral force. And I had about 2 years ago, I had picked my son up from school one day, and he was having a hard time with bullying, and he's the same age as this young man in Australia. And a few days,
is he little also?
He's little also. My two oldest are little. My youngest is average height. And a few days after that was Mother's Day, and I had been asked by Rewire to write a piece for Mother's Day about being a mom with a disability. And so I had said to my son in the car, I was like, so, hey, I was asked to write a piece about being a mom. Can I write about the conversation we had the other day about you being bullied? And he paused, and my son has no shortage of opinions, and he's like,
why?
No.
I wonder why that is, yeah.
He was like, no, I'm not okay with that. And I was like, okay. And he's like, it's my story. And he said, Mommy, you always talk about how stories have power. I don't want you to tell people my story. And I had to pause and be like, the activist advocate in me is like, really? That's crap. And then the mom in me was like, no, he's right. He's got you there. And so I instead wrote about his right to define his story and his right to talk about what he's comfortable with me sharing and what he's uncomfortable with me sharing. And if he's not comfortable with me sharing something, I won't, because that's his story. No matter where he goes in life, someone can type in his name, as it is now, and he'll show up in pictures at anti-Kavanaugh rallies.
Right.
He'll show up crashing a stage at the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network gala several years ago when he was probably 3 or 4. But he has a right to choose what parts of his story he puts out in the world. And it's very clear in looking at this video that this young man in Australia was never given the right to choose.
Right.
And so wherever he goes, whether it's a first date, a first job interview, they're doing background checks for his passport, whatever it might be. They type his name into a computer, and quite literally the first thing that comes up is a YouTube video with over 2 million views of him crying about wanting to kill himself. And that's not fair. No one deserves to be defined by their moment of most pain when they're 9 years old.
Right. No, I think that's such a wise and compassionate reaction to it. And it gets it. I mean, it's like a Venn diagram as a topic. It overlaps with, but is not exclusively a disability issue, right? Because it also gets into, I forget what they were called. There was a name for them. The several bloggers, the mommy bloggers, who, in my opinion, anyway, as a parent and now a grandparent, overshared
Oh, yeah.
wildly about their children. I mean, this is not a phenomenon that could even happen when I was a kid, probably when you were a kid.
No.
And but you have that issue on the one hand, which is just the general recognition of children as autonomous beings with a right to their story, with a right to their privacy, with a right to, with human rights, right?
Yeah.
Children are also a largely unexplored territory of human rights,
Yeah.
right? Because we don't acknowledge them fully as human beings legally and politically and so on. And then on the disability side, I just wonder to what extent the video, however, I'm sure unintentionally on the part of the parents and probably unintentionally on the part of the viewers, falls into this tradition of little people as a media trope,
Oh,
as a
definitely.
sort of the even I, I've not studied little people as a cultural trope, but I'm certainly well aware of the Wizard of Oz. I'm well aware that there was a Western movie using just
The
the
Terror of
Terror of
Tiny
Tiny Town.
Town.
Yeah, and you have that, and all of it to me signals that little people, like Black people, like Asian people, like other groups, to white people as the dominant cultural default, acquire, I'm trying to think of the right way to put this, kind of cultural symbolism.
Yeah.
They are,
Yes.
Black people, if you look at the racist movies of the 20s, they were powerful and fierce, and, they're kind of like the id of, if you look at, movies with little people, they tend to be, in some way, I would characterize them as not human, or
Yeah.
not quite human. They're elves or munchkins or they're objects of humor, dwarf tossing and all that, where somehow, I mean, you wouldn't do, like I'm half Jewish, right? You
Yeah.
wouldn't do, if somebody had Jew tossing at their event, people would understand, yeah, that's not appropriate actually. Jew tossing at your party is probably, you oughtn't do that. And yet,
Yeah, we have a federal judge on the bench that repeatedly uses dwarf tossing as a justification for freedom of speech. Judge Naomi Rao, who was appointed by President Trump, has repeatedly gone back to using dwarf tossing as an example of the tremendous freedom of speech in this country.
Oh, it's a sign of our greatness.
Yes, it is a sign of our greatness. And it was one of those, I remember when a younger staffer at the Center for American Progress came running into my office and was like, Rebecca, he's nominating a judge who supports dwarf tossing. And I was like, there's no way. There's no way. After Kavanaugh, there's no way. And I looked her up and it was like, oh no, she cites it frequently as one of her favorite cases.
So again, we're talking with Rebecca Cokley of the Center for American Progress. She's the director of the Disability Justice Initiative, and mind blown at the description of that judge. I wonder what she feels about Jew tossing. Does she endorse that? But of course, I always do that analog thing, right?
Yeah.
Because it's one way to understand how we haven't come as far as we need to. I do it with myself, by the way. I think, well, that's not about dwarf tossing, but there may be an issue where I think, well, is that okay? I'll substitute another ethnic group. And then I'll think, or another minority, I'll think, wow, that's really bad. That's actually really bad. Terror of Jewtown. It's just like, that wouldn't be funny,
No.
Or maybe it would be funny, but it would be offensive. To some people, they might find it amusing. But, okay, so we have this young man here, this poor kid who's going to have to live with this the rest of his life, right? I mean, but you took it as a teaching moment. And I hope some people at least got something out of that. Let's just to close, I want to talk about more general disability issues too, but to close off on at least this portion of little people and their rights, what else is going on in terms of that struggle that maybe people should know about?
I think right now, like one of the largest conversations is obviously about genetic testing and genetic developments, and they've actually they are in trial right now. There's a treatment for my kind of dwarfism. And
Meaning something that would be administered in utero or something?
no, after birth, it's available. And what's been very fascinating to me and watching all the conversation on it has been the fact that I don't know any families with little people parents who have kids that are doing it. All the families I see doing it are families with average height parents. And so for me, it continues to just really indicate the importance of connection to community, the importance of kids with dwarfism, a majority of which grew up in families with nobody like them, having access to heroes and role models and people they know who are people with dwarfism. My husband's average height. You met him earlier today. My son has said a couple of times, well, Mommy, I wish I was tall like Daddy. And our response to him is, well, you might not be tall like Daddy, but instead you're going to be around the same height as your Uncle Carlton, who's an amazing drummer, or your Uncle Dan, who's a carpenter, or any other number of dwarf LP, little person men we know who he looks up to already and has connections with. And usually after that, he's fine. He's like, oh, okay, Uncle Dan's really cool. He makes things. Uncle Carlton can bash out a drum solo like nobody else. That's awesome. I'm going to be like them. But it really is important to have those connections, and I think with the conversation around genetics, we always have these conversations about, just because you can do something. It's the Gattaca question, like just because you can do something,
right.
should you?
And Rebecca Cokley, I want to pick up on that a little bit, the genetic question, because I've thought about this a lot in terms of my own situation. I was telling you earlier before we started recording that our last conversation made me think a lot about my own situation, because in today's disability nomenclature, and bear in mind, I was born in 1953, so I was born... I'm a time traveler, right? Just by being alive.
Yeah.
The world was in many ways very different then. I would now be described as a member of the neurodiverse community. Okay, I cognitively different. Okay, I have very severe ADD, if you want to call it severe. I also have a hearing disability, so between not hearing well and the concentration issues, I was always, the hearing disability probably started around age 10 when I had some problems, but all of it was like, Richard is, people would kind of nod and say, well, Richard's not all here. That was all they said, right?
Yeah.
Well, you know how Richard is. My aunt used to do a gesture that for those listening on radio won't get, but it was kind of like, Richard, he's somewhere else. So I had to go through even not only my education, but the first 20 years of my career, at least the 20 years I spent in the corporate world, working with a disability wasn't entirely sure I had. I figured out the ADD thing, but wasn't entirely sure what the implications of that were. And I certainly did not know I had rights associated with it. So I flamed out on a lot of jobs that didn't work out, that kind of thing. But the genetic question, if my parents, if they could have known, would they have chosen to genetically, I'm not talking about the hearing so much as the cognitive stuff, and along with it came severe depression, hospitalized twice, but would they have chosen to alter it? Because even if it meant keeping the depression, which is a very rough road if you haven't been down it, I wouldn't have wanted them to. I wouldn't want to be another person. I would not want my brain to work in a different way than it works, even though it's a struggle today.
Yeah.
Even though there are difficult days, especially with the concentration stuff. It more normally is okay, but I had to learn to accept medication. I had to learn to accept I don't do some things as well as I do other things, but I do some things super well. And I would not have wanted them to change it. I would not want to be more like other people. You, it sounds like, would not have wanted your parents to change it either. So it's a stupid question, maybe, but how did we learn to accept ourselves?
That is such a great question. I mean, I think about it frequently, just in terms of, yeah, I mean, that conversation both as a parent, as a person with a disability. I mean, we're very clear with our kids that they will have like bad dwarf days. Like I've had a bad dwarf day. There's been days I've walked down the street and been screamed at like midget, midget, midget. Hey, is a circus in town? Things like that. And that sucks. And I think one of the things that I've taken from friends in my life, you know, in this case particularly Senator Tammy Duckworth, who frequently says it's important to acknowledge the suck.
Mm-hmm.
And she's like, and like there are days that it really sucks. And then there are days when people have that whole conversation about not letting your disability define you. One of the things that she says, and I firmly agree with, is my disability is the reason I am who I am today.
Mm-hmm.
I worked at the White House for President Obama as in charge of diversity recruitment for political appointments because I'm a little person, because of the experiences that I had tied to my dwarfism, because of the networks that I developed as a result of my dwarfism, because of the career path I chose, which in large part had to do with the fact that I'm a little person.
Mm-hmm.
And I would never change that. And it's never been about overcoming, to me, by any means. It's always been about succeeding with my dwarfism. Like it's an intricate part of who I am. It's a part of my culture. It's a part of the decisions I make on a daily basis. And I would never want to demean or belittle that as lesser or less important than what it really is.
Yeah, and I think that's one reason why I'm feeling more and more strongly about and thank you for that, why Rebecca Cokley, I'm feeling more and more strongly about disability rights, because when I was a child, if my parents had had a video camera, there might have been a video like that. I was bullied because I did not behave or think or act like and I'm not asking anybody to bring out the violins, right? You know, that's not what this is about. But it never occurred to me that I had something, and B, that it was something I could lean into and embrace.
Yeah.
And I don't want other kids to live that way. And my first 20 years of work, I didn't try to lean into it to the extent that I was aware of it, which wasn't much. I tried to overcome it. Mm-hmm. I was taught that whatever disadvantage you have, pound fist on table. I won't do it because it's bad for the audio, but pound, pound, pound. You through force of will, you overcome it. Well, that was like, there was a lot of stupidity in that advice. There was like a world of stupid in that advice, because the fact is, I was trying to do things that I was not suited for, and I was not doing things for which I was exceptionally suited. You know, and when I left that world, I started writing, and which was what I did before. And I said blogging had been invented, and every once in a while my wife would say, and she's been fantastic about the whole transition, but she would say, shouldn't you be like looking for a job or something? You know, it's like a legitimate question. And I was but I should have been writing, I should have been talking, I should have been, working with other people. So I guess only now, as I approach, the back 40, as a friend of mine would say, am I even becoming aware that embracing it is an option?
Well, I think we're seeing things change. I mean, it continues to. I've worked on presidential campaigns every cycle going back to John Kerry's race, and watching over time in political spaces the increased inclusion of people with disabilities and disability rights issues into presidential campaigns and platforms. And going from, for me, thinking about, even starting before that, even starting with like George H.W. Bush and his ardent passion for the ADA, mm-hmm. And Attorney General Dick Thornburgh working together to get the law passed with, the millions of activists and advocates that were working on that, and him actually talking about the ADA in his inaugural address and his pledge and his commitment to signing Americans with Disabilities Rights Act. Moving into, the Clinton administration and them hiring people with disabilities in the White House, to, George H.W. Bush signing the New Freedom Initiative and supporting the Office of Disability Employment Policy, and continuing to hire people with disabilities in political appointments, to the Obama years and what we were able to do, and actually coming out ahead of time with a disability policy agenda. And, President Obama came out with his disability policy agenda in December of 2007, so less than a year from the general election. Fast forward to today, not to ignore the tremendous work that the Hillary Clinton campaign did, but if we were to skip ahead to now, to this cycle, at the same point in time, in December of 2019, the same point in time between then and this upcoming election and the Obama release of his plan and the 2008 election, we had 9 candidates come out with disability policy platforms, all of which contain very common core elements: full funding for special education, elimination of the sub-minimum wage, and elimination of asset limits, the need for a robust, high-quality, long-term services and supports agenda within Medicare for All or whatever their particular healthcare platform was, and then sort of varying from there. And I mean, to go from one candidate talking about it back in 2008 to everybody talking about it, to there being questions about sub-minimum wage, there being questions about special education funding in the debates, to, last night, Senator Warren at CNN's town hall managed to weave disability into 4 questions, only one of which actually pertained to disability. One was talking about issues within families around being part of the sandwich generation. Another question talked about bipartisanship and what are issues that people can work together on. And she talked about a over-the-counter cost reduction bill for hearing aids. That's not normal. I keep pinching myself because just the amount of advancement that we've made this cycle to get to where we are today, with candidates bringing on disability policy committees, hiring disabled people to do advance on their campaigns, which to me is just mind-blowing. Pete Buttigieg, one of his senior advance leads, uses a wheelchair. And so they can't plan any event in a non-accessible location because that doesn't work for Emily. And I never would have thought we'd see the day, having worked on campaigns for years, where we could get into the advance space and what that would mean to have somebody like Emily Vorday in that particular role on that campaign, redefining what accessible and inclusive events looks like. And it really does show to me, on those days when I feel like, oh my God, we're not making any progress, or oh gosh, like, what did Trump do this morning? That we are gaining ground and that we are seeing shifts being made in real tangible ways that are mainstreaming disability in a way that's not just palatable for us as the community, and it's not pandering to us, but it's being done in a seamless way, a non-tokenistic way, and talking about policy delivery and talking about campaign logistics. It's just done as a reality.
It's so good to hear you say that. And I guess as a final thought from me, and then I'll let you conclude, but this issue of bipartisanship is interesting to me because, if I'm honest, I probably don't have the reputation as the most bipartisan guy
Me either.
in the world. And when it comes to economic issues, for example, I have opinions that are considered quite strong, even among Democrats, okay? But I do think that when it comes to disability, understanding disability issues, when it comes to disability as a civil rights issue, I do think that, bipartisanship, transpartisanship. I'm glad you mentioned George H.W. Bush. I mean, I'll just tell a quick story and then I'll leave it to you to conclude. But I belong to a support group that prefers its members don't publicly identify themselves as members of the support group, but for people who have trouble with drugs and alcohol, which is common comorbidity with the kind of problems I have. I went to one meeting where there was a right-winger there. I spoke at a meeting who whose views I find profoundly abhorrent on most issues. And he came up to me afterwards and said he appreciated what I had to say. He had some of the same problems. Could we talk? I was more than happy to talk to him. I would, my path to getting better is, Dr. Judith Herman has written books about this, is in helping others. So I don't care on certain issues. If you're a Democrat or Republican, Democratic Socialist or radical right-winger or whatever, there are some issues that transcend even my opinionated beliefs. And to me, the worth and dignity of every human being, which is what we're talking about here, is is the foundation of that transcendent principle. So I'm not going to be any nicer, but I am going to say that I will talk to anybody anytime about this kind of thing. And that's my closing thought. What's yours?
It's funny that you mentioned that. I always think about, I have a longtime close personal friend, Cheryl Sensenbrenner, Congressman Jim Sensenbrenner's wife. And for a long time, Cheryl served as the board president for the American Association of People with Disabilities. And Cheryl is fabulousness incarnate. An amazing person, an amazing advocate, is the reason that the ADA Amendments Act was passed and we saw the original intent of the law restored, because she quite literally would take off her leg braces and throw them on the ground and sit outside Republican offices and say, why has your boss not come and talked to me about this bill yet? And she would be like, we can wait for press, we can wait for security. Either way, it's going to get ugly. Tell your boss I want to talk to him. And watching Cheryl move around those circles, and in particular, watching the really close relationship that she has still today, even though her health has been really struggling, with people like Paul Ryan, who I remember going into visiting Cheryl in the hospital one time, and there was like a card and a note and a photo of her hanging out with Paul Ryan and his wife. And she looked at it and she looked at me, and her communication is pretty limited, and she just started laughing. And I was like, I'm glad that your fan club is as diverse as it is. And I said, I don't think I've ever been in a space with as much love for Paul Ryan as your hospital room. And she told me how he was like her little brother, and how when he was elected, she helped him and his wife like find a house and navigate Washington and sort of like go through the rigmarole of a new member of Congress. And I won't lie, 90% of the time whenever I see Paul Ryan out and about or doing anything, I'm just like, oh, that guy. And then I remind myself, I'm like, no, he visits my friend Cheryl monthly. He sends her flowers. He and his wife bring her presents. And how important that is. And that sort of thing really matters. And being able, I think disability has always been one of those issues where we can bridge the divide, even though right now it's a lot harder, I think, than it's ever been.
Well, we can certainly give it a try.
Definitely.
Right? All right. Well, Rebecca Cokley of the Center for American Progress Disability Justice Initiative, thanks for your great work.
Thank you so much for having me, RJ.
Always a